The prairie wind brushed softly across the small wooden porch of the Lone Creek Ranch, carrying with it the faint scent of dust, sage, and wildflowers that grew stubbornly along the fence line. The world stretched endlessly around her, miles and miles of golden grass swaying under the dying light of the sun. Evening was settling in, slow and gentle, as if the whole land was sighing after a long, hard day. Clara sat quietly on the porch steps, her fingers nervously twisting the frayed hem of her faded blue dress. It had been a long week, longer than most. She'd been helping Mrs. Lyle cook for the ranch hands, scrub the linens, and mend torn shirts until her fingers were raw. Yet, it wasn't the work that made her tired. It was the silence afterward, when everyone had gone to rest, and the echoes of her own thoughts filled the air. Out here, under the open sky, she couldn't hide from them. She had never felt at home on the ranch. Not really. Every woman who passed through seemed to carry a kind of brightness, clean dresses, soft curls, confident laughter that turned heads and drew smiles. Clara had none of that. She was plain, her face marked by sun and wind, her hair dull and tangled from long days of labor. Her hands were rough, her shoulders always tense, her smile, when it came, hesitant, like a habit forgotten over time. She glanced at the window beside her, catching her reflection in the faint glow of the kerosene lamp inside. Her heart sank a little at what she saw. The reflection didn't lie. A pale face, hollowed from too many late nights, eyes that seemed a bit too sad for someone her age. She turned her gaze away quickly, ashamed for reasons she couldn't quite name. That's when she heard boots scuffing against the porch boards. The sound was familiar, steady, unhurried, like a heartbeat that never changed pace no matter what the world threw at it. Jed Marshall, the cowboy who worked the south end of the ranch. He was a man of few words, and maybe that was what set him apart. He didn't fill the air with noise or charm like the others did. He just was, solid, grounded, dependable. Clara kept her eyes down as he approached. She felt him stop a few feet away, his shadow stretching across her boots. The sun had almost dipped below the hills, leaving only a deep orange afterglow that painted everything in quiet warmth. "Long day," Jed said simply, his voice carrying that deep, slow drawl that came from years of talking only when something needed to be said. Clara nodded, unsure how to answer. She didn't trust her voice, it always sounded too small next to his. "Guess so," she murmured after a moment. He shifted his weight, leaning against one of the porch posts. The wooden rail creaked faintly beneath his hand. "You doin' all right?" he asked. She hesitated, surprised by the question. Most men didn't ask that, not really. They said it out of politeness, then moved on before hearing an answer. But Jed looked at her as if he actually wanted to know. And that frightened her more than it comforted her. "I'm fine," she said quickly, then paused. Her throat felt tight. I don't fit in much around here." Jed didn't reply right away. He glanced toward the horizon, where the last light was fading into violet dusk. The silence stretched between them, easy but heavy with unspoken things. Then, softly, she said the words that had lived inside her for years, "I'm not pretty." The moment she said it, she wished she could take it back. It wasn't something a woman should admit aloud, not out here, where reputation and appearance carried weight. But the words had slipped out, small and trembling, like a secret too long kept. Jed didn't laugh. He didn't offer the usual kind reassurance or empty compliments she had heard from strangers who didn't mean them. Instead, he stayed quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the endless stretch of land before them. Then he spoke, slow, sure, every word deliberate. "That's fine," he said, his tone deep and calm. "I need honest, not fancy." Clara turned her head toward him, startled by the simplicity of it. He wasn't trying to fix her or comfort her. He was just telling the truth, the kind that didn't need polishing. His gaze met hers, steady and sincere. Something inside her shifted. For the first time, someone hadn't tried to measure her against others. He'd just accepted her, plain as she was. And that simple acceptance felt like sunlight breaking through a long, cold morning. The prairie wind moved between them again, carrying the faint sound of crickets and the low hum of the world settling into night. Clara looked out over the horizon and realized her heart felt a little lighter. Maybe beauty wasn't about mirrors or fine words. Maybe it was about being seen, truly seen, and still being enough. The weeks rolled by like soft waves across the prairie, slow, steady, and full of quiet moments that seemed to shape the rhythm of life at Lone Creek Ranch. Clara found herself settling into a pattern she hadn't expected. Every morning, before the sun had fully risen, she would see Jed Marshall already out in the pasture, moving with that same calm determination, the horses trailing behind him like shadows. He worked hard, never complaining, never rushing. There was something almost sacred in the way he respected the land and the creatures that depended on it. Clara had started waking up earlier just to catch those few minutes of peace before the others stirred. Sometimes she'd watch Jed from the kitchen window as she kneaded dough or poured coffee for the hands. There was a steadiness in him that drew her, like the world could be falling apart, and he'd still keep his footing. During the long days, she began to notice little things she hadn't before. The way Jed's hat tilted slightly forward when he was thinking. The faint scar along his jaw, just visible when the light hit right. The way his laughter, rare but real, sounded rough, as if it had to fight its way out. He didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened. His words carried a kind of weight that didn't come from age or rank, it came from truth. Clara wasn't used to that. She'd spent her whole life surrounded by people who said what others wanted to hear. She'd learned early to stay quiet, to keep her opinions tucked away. But Jed had a way of making silence feel less like emptiness and more like understanding. One afternoon, the wind picked up across the plains, turning the sky hazy with dust. Clara had gone out to the old corral where one of the gates had come loose. She tugged at the rusted hinge, frustrated, when Jed appeared, rope slung over his shoulder, shirt damp with sweat from the heat. "Gate givin' you trouble?" he asked, a faint smile touching his lips. She frowned, wiping her brow. "Seems everything does lately." He crouched beside her, inspecting the bent nail that held the hinge in place. "Ain't the nail's fault," he said after a moment. "Just worn down from too much weather. Happens to the best of us." Clara looked at him sharply, trying to decide if he meant more by that. But he didn't look up, just kept working, pulling out his pocket knife and hammering the piece back into place. When he finished, he stood, brushing the dust off his jeans. "Try it now," he said. She pushed on the gate, and it swung smoothly with a faint creak. "Well, look at that," she murmured. Jed grinned. "Sometimes, things just need a little fixing. Don't mean they're no good." For a moment, they just stood there, close enough for her to catch the faint scent of leather and sun on his clothes. She wanted to say something, but her words caught in her throat. Then, unexpectedly, he reached down and plucked a small daisy growing by the fence post. "Here," he said, tucking it gently into her hair. Clara froze. It wasn't much, just a tiny flower, its petals already starting to wilt from the heat, but something about the gesture hit her deeper than she expected. No one had ever done that for her. No one had ever looked at her like she was worth a second glance, let alone a flower. She blinked, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "That's silly," she muttered, touching the daisy self-consciously. "Maybe," Jed said, his eyes soft. "But it suits you." Her heart gave a small, startled flutter. She turned away quickly, pretending to adjust the gate again. But she couldn't stop the faint smile that crept across her lips, small, uncertain, but real. It had been years since she'd felt anything like that. From that day on, things felt different. Jed didn't say much about it, but every time he passed her in the yard, he'd tip his hat with a quiet nod, as if the two of them shared a secret no one else needed to know. Clara found herself humming while she worked, catching herself smiling at nothing at all. One evening, after a long day of mending and cooking, she caught her reflection again, this time in the metal water basin outside the barn. The woman staring back still had tired eyes and windblown hair, but there was something new there. A spark, faint but alive. She didn't look beautiful, not in the way the world defined it, but she looked content. And when Jed came walking toward her through the fading light, that small daisy still tucked behind his hatband, Clara realized something simple and quiet. He had never once told her she was beautiful, but somehow, he'd made her believe it anyway. Autumn rolled across the prairie like a slow-moving tide, turning the long summer grasses gold and crisp beneath the wide, endless sky. The mornings came cooler now, with mist curling over the fields and the air thick with the smell of dry earth and wood smoke. Clara had been at Lone Creek Ranch for months by then, and the place no longer felt strange. The kitchen, the stables, the soft creak of the porch steps beneath her boots, it had all become part of her world, woven into her days like threads in a worn but beloved quilt. Her life had a rhythm now. She'd rise before the first hint of dawn, light the fire, and start the coffee pot for the ranch hands. By the time the sun broke over the hills, she'd already be outside, hanging laundry or scattering feed for the hens. And always, somewhere nearby, Jed would be working. He moved through the land like someone who belonged to it. Every motion deliberate, every word measured. The others liked to talk big, laugh loud, make noise just to fill the space, but not him. Jed's silence wasn't emptiness, it was peace. Clara had grown to understand that silence. It had become the place where her heart rested. Sometimes, they worked side by side without a word between them, fixing fences, gathering wood, tending to the horses. Other times, he'd tell her small stories, the kind a man only shares when the day is quiet and trust has settled in. He'd talk about the first horse he ever broke, or how he used to sleep under the stars when the ranch was still being built. He never made things sound grand or heroic, but there was a quiet pride in the way he spoke about living honestly, about doing the right thing even when no one was watching. And Clara listened, really listened, because somewhere along the way, his words started building something inside her, a sense of belonging, of worth, of being seen. It happened one night under a sky so clear it felt like the stars were close enough to touch. Clara was sitting on the porch again, the same place where she'd whispered, "I'm not pretty," months ago. The old boards creaked beneath her feet, the lantern beside her throwing a soft golden circle of light. Jed stepped up behind her, his boots scuffing against the wood, and for a moment, it felt like time folded back on itself. "You ever gonna stop thinking you're not enough?" he asked, his voice low and calm. Clara smiled faintly, eyes still fixed on the horizon. "Maybe," she said softly. "You sure don't make it easy to keep believing it." Jed let out a quiet chuckle, the sound rolling like warm thunder. "Good," he said. "I'd rather fight that lie than listen to it." He sat down beside her, resting his elbows on his knees. "You know, there's a kind of beauty in honesty. Most folks spend their lives trying to look like someone else. But you," he glanced at her, his gaze steady. "You don't hide what you are. You work hard. You care. You mean what you say. That's worth more than fancy words or fancy looks." She didn't know what to say to that. Compliments had always felt empty to her, like borrowed things that didn't quite fit. But Jed's words, they weren't decoration. They were truth, simple and steady. And somehow, they settled deep into her heart, right where her old doubts used to live. The wind rustled across the fields, brushing through the dry grass like a whisper. The smell of cedar smoke drifted from the fire pit where the hands were laughing somewhere in the distance. For once, Clara didn't feel like an outsider listening from the shadows. She felt part of it all, woven into the land, the laughter, the stillness. "Do you ever miss the world beyond this place?" she asked suddenly. "All those bright towns and beautiful people?" Jed turned his head toward her, his hat brim low over his brow. "No," he said after a long pause. "I've seen plenty of pretty. But pretty fades. Honest stays." Clara met his eyes then, and for the first time in years, she didn't look away. There was no pity there, no judgment, only warmth and quiet certainty. As the stars deepened and the crickets sang, she leaned back against the porch post, breathing in the cool night air. The doubts that had once clung to her seemed to loosen, falling away like dry leaves in the wind. She was still the same woman, plain, worn, and weathered, but she no longer felt small inside her own skin. Beside her, Jed sat in easy silence, hat tilted back, eyes on the stars. The two of them didn't need fancy words or perfect faces. What they had was simple, real, and lasting. And as the prairie wind wrapped around them, soft and endless, Clara finally understood, beauty wasn't something she had to earn. It was something she'd always carried, hidden beneath the dust and the doubt, waiting for someone honest enough to see it.